Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Has Donald Trump been good for America? And is he going to win this election? Let's get to the bottom line. In this polarized country, half of the people see President Donald Trump as a divisive and harmful leader, and the other half see him as a messiah. This 50-50 split applies to everything about him. Half of the American people get inspiration from him, and the other half cringe. So what makes him popular? What makes folks vote for him? And how do his chances look for re-election next month? Well, today we're talking to someone who worked closely with President Trump and his closest supporters in his 2016 election campaign, which, as we all know, worked. Rick Gates was the deputy campaign manager for Trump's 2016 election. He's a former assistant to Paul Manafort, a top Republican strategist and lobbyist, and both came under investigation as part of the Mueller investigation into Russian interference in the last elections. He cooperated with the investigation, and last year he was sentenced to 3 years probation for financial crimes and lying to the FBI. This week, he published a book about his work with the first Trump campaign, his role in the FBI investigation, and more. It's called Wicked Game, an insider's story on how Donald Trump won, Mueller failed, and America lost. Rick, it's great to be with you today. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me just ask you, you were there at the beginning when Paul Manafort was hired for free, to come in and advise the Trump campaign on how to approach the 2016 election. And I'd just like to get your insights on that and apply it to today. Does it look like Donald Trump is going to win to you?
Absolutely. Steve, first, thanks for having me on the show. Great to be here. Look, 2016 was a very interesting time in presidential politics. And one of the things that I kind of capture in my book is this idea that, Donald Trump was, in a way, fighting the Republican Party establishment much more than he was Hillary Clinton in the general election. And I think that's important because as we go back and look historically at how presidents are elected, there were a number of instances along the way that clearly the Republican Party and the Republican Party leadership did not want President Trump to win. And so when you look at the technical processes that are behind how a president actually secures, or candidate secures, a nomination, there's a lot more to it than people realize. So it was a good opportunity to kind of walk people through understanding how presidents are actually elected.
Were there parts of this story that were uncomfortable for you? I was surprised that you kind of look at what you did for him as a hired person. And to be, candid with our audience, you've also worked with Democrats in the past. I thought you described beautifully, particularly in international campaign consulting. Lots of Democrats and Republicans work together. But you also critique President Trump for a kind of recklessness, somewhat, a kind of lightness with the truth. But I'm just interested in how someone in your role felt about certain key moments during the campaign and whether you thought it was going the wrong direction.
So obviously at any campaign, at any point, there are instances where candidates can go off, say something that probably doesn't resonate as well. The example that I use in the book, with President Trump, it relates to, Judge Curiel, who obviously, became an issue. The thing that you have to understand, I think, about President Trump is he's not politically correct. And one of the reasons that he wanted to run is because he felt that politicians were not very authentic, and more importantly, they never delivered on what they said they were going to do. And the one thing that I did get to see is his passion and his love for the country, and that's really what drove him into this race. But look, on the flip side, you had Hillary Clinton, at the magical moment when she had her infamous deplorables, comment. So in any candidacy, there are always going to be issues. I think what you have to, understand is looking at the way that both campaigns deal with those moments, because those are very, very important moments of how people are going to react and how they're going to be perceived. And in Donald Trump's case, in my opinion, because he was an outsider and because he was not a politician, people embraced his directness, his authenticity. They had never seen a candidate like this before, and so they gravitated towards something like that because they were tired of the political system.
There were moments where Donald Trump stepped forward and started a style of really demeaning Hillary Clinton, demeaning his opponents, demeaning the press. Some of the terms he called were crooked Hillary, the corrupt news media, the failing New York Times, brain dead Bernie. I mean, it's a fascinating, but kind of disconcerting style. But in the end, Hillary Clinton went out after she lost and she said, we need to give Donald Trump a chance. That didn't come out in your book as much, that here was a moment essentially where I think Hillary telegraphed her people, because it seemed to me Donald Trump does well when he's portrayed himself as a victim. Am I getting something wrong there?
So what I would say about that is that, when Hillary came out of that moment, if you remember the night before, there was a lot of question of whether or not, they were going to concede or even make a comment. And I think as you're going to see in 2020, and why it's important, is the stakes are extremely high. And just the other day, Joe Biden came out with a comment relative that, now he thinks he can't lose, and the only way he can lose is if there's some, kind of shenanigans, happening behind the scenes. So I think what you're seeing is a reaction by, both sides to the belief that this election is going to be so intense that we all kind of need to step back and make sure that what's most important is protecting our democracy, right? Because that's really what this is about. It's about being able to elect a president, having the right and the privilege to vote, and making sure that our vote is an expression of the person that we support. So I think, to your question, I think it's going to be interesting to see, how these candidates both come together. And the one thing I'll say, to a previous point you made, the greatest asset the president has are his instincts. And, 99.9% of the time, he's generally right. So when he sees kind of some of this, potential election fraud, he's highlighting it because at some point you're probably going to see some instance of it. It may be insignificant. It may not matter to the overall result, but he's right about it existing in certain states.
Is there a red line for his behavior in the election that would, be something to help you see it differently? And you just raised the issue of accepting election results, which is on everyone's mind. You just said, Biden, may be concerned at all. But I guess one side is posture, and then the other side is after the election. You know these folks very well. Would it be a red line for you if you saw the president not accept those results and to, continue essentially, a might makes right, power contest?
Sure. If the election were held and it was free and fair and the results came out, in favor of Joe Biden, and look, I think the president would ultimately concede. I think what he does very well is he throws messages out into the public domain. The media, of course, take in every bit of bait that they can. And then it comes across either as something that he hasn't fully expressed, or frankly, there are things that, he will often say that he doesn't necessarily, really mean. And we just have to watch for that. But I will tell you, based on experience, that he does believe that there are potentials, and now Joe Biden does as well, that there could be, fraudulent circumstances in this election with ballots missing, incompleted, whatever the case may be. So I do think there's going to be a greater awareness on the freeness and fairness of this election. But at the end of the day, President Trump, like I said, he loves his country. He will protect and really promote the democracy in the end.
One of the questions that a lot of people have about President Trump and his surroundings, which you deal with in the book, is whether or not he respects experts, whether he listens to them, whether he, puts policy expertise paramount, or at least science paramount in some of the cases relating to COVID. And you describe how you were able to influence him, particularly in foreign policy, and get him to listen to experts. What are some tips you would share with those folks who want President Trump to learn something about the issues he's being asked to decide on?
Sure. First and foremost, the president has very strong convictions about, a host of policy issues. And on those issues, he was largely unmovable. On other ones that, again, you got to remember, he's an outsider. So on other issues that maybe weren't as prevalent in his mind at the time of when he first ran to today, where now he is president for the entire country. And so there's a multitude of other issues that have, landed on his plate. I think there are a number of things. He absolutely listens, to advisors. In fact, he learns by listening. And that's why, there are a couple of references, not just from me, but from other people as well, that, putting a 100-page document in front of him is just not the way that he learns and learns best. So by consulting with people, by hearing people's opinions, and look, he did a great job on the campaign. He would call 15, 20 people on a regular basis and solicit, their input. And sometimes he would lead them down one direction just to see what they would say. And I always thought he had a very, interesting way of reaching out to people and one, making them feel important, and two, making their opinion count and matter. And then he was able to kind of take all that in and synthesize it. And then he would make his own decision. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we have not had in many presidents in the past, is an absolute decisive decision maker. Like, his decisions are his decisions. And that's I think that's a particularly strong asset, for a president to have.
So, Rick, my jaw dropped wide open. I think it fell on the floor when I was reading the chapter on the vice president. Tell us, I had been talking to Chris Christie, and Chris Christie, as you write, thought he was guy up until the night before the president announced his selection, just days before the Republican convention. But tell us where President Trump started with his desire for a vice presidential candidate, and then how you and Paul Manafort redirected him.
Sure. Look, that is probably one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is to capture this type of history so that Americans could see kind of what happens behind the scenes. How do you choose a vice president? And in the case of President Trump, I mean, at the time, his idea of a good vice president was somebody kind of like him, somebody that, he could be friends with, that he knew, that he understood. And if you ask any political operative or person with political experience, they will tell you that you're always looking for a candidate that can bring something to the table, i.e. electoral votes. And so with the case with Mike Pence, it was, one thing after the other in trying to get him into that position.
But he didn't. But you didn't. Not to interrupt, but you didn't start with Mike Pence. You started with someone really, really like him, and I'm referring to Ivanka.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I put in the book, I mean, after we go through a list of potential candidates, some of them he knows, some of them, most of them he doesn't. Again, this is one of his strong assets. What does he go to? What does he gravitate toward? It's family, it's loyalty, it's trust. And people have often tried to take this instance or this anecdote I wanted to use out of context and make it look like he was going to, absolutely choose her. In the end, as I say, he would have never, I think, gotten there. But what he was trying to do is show, you've got to remember, he's a CEO, not a politician. So he's not thinking like a politician. So in his mind, who are the best people around him? Who are the best and brightest? In this case, and a lot of people, interestingly, wrote op-eds at the very time that it was being discussed, that she would make, a tremendous VP candidate. And a lot of people think that she still would. But with that said, it was an anecdote to show what matters to him the most. So as we, Paul and I tried to figure out what kind of criteria he was looking for, we learned along the way about those most important assets to him.
Nonetheless, I find it absolutely fascinating that when you began looking and you moved from the Ivanka Trump, possibility, and she removed herself from that, then you moved to Mike Pence, who had endorsed Ted Cruz, whom Donald Trump had sort of seen himself as a loser, kept calling Mike Pence a loser. But you and Paul Manafort thought that he was really the right guy. How did you succeed to shove the president in his corner so well so that stuck? Because there are not many stories out there where people who had been so firmly against the president managed to become so closely aligned with him.
Sure. I like to say it was divine intervention at some juncture, because we had so many obstacles hit us along the way, with Mike Pence, little things to big things, where it just made the relationship, awkward at the beginning. But, the president, came around to the idea of understanding, the value of somebody in that role. And the real decisive point, and look, it took a lot of people. It wasn't just, Paul and I. It was a lot of people that the president consulted with. As I said, he makes his own decisions. So even though he might get a recommendation, he does his own research. He does his own, kind of analysis, and then polls a lot of people to see what their thoughts are on it as well. But in the end, there was one defining moment I felt that really kind of switched the president's thinking on Mike Pence, and that was kind of when Paul was explaining to Donald Trump what a vice president was supposed to do. And in traditional politics, the vice president is somebody that kind of is the guy out there, attacking his opponent, coming across as very negative, and then that way it enables the presidential candidate to look presidential. Well, in this case, Donald Trump was that individual. So Paul simply said, Donald, why would you want somebody like you to step into that role that you are so good at? and that is your role. So it's almost in this case, the roles of what a vice president candidate would do on a campaign trail were already embodied in the way that Donald Trump had approached the campaign. So that little kind of idea planted in his head, I think, gave him the ability to kind of expand his thinking on, well, wait a minute, let's think about this. Let's consider other people. And then again, it took a lot of people to get Mike Pence to ultimately be chosen. But obviously, I don't think there's anybody out of that original list that we had that would have been more loyal.
Right.
And has proven it.
And Rick, another key part of your story with the Trump campaign is this Russia thing, right? So, and I have to say, I go back to sort of Trey Gowdy, former Congressman Trey Gowdy, who stepped in, to sort of chair the House Intelligence Committee, said, hey, if you're innocent, act like it. And there were a lot of people looking at President Trump's statements about Hillary Clinton's emails or calling on Russia to, generate these. And we now know from the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which is a bipartisan report, that there was a very dense set of interactions from lots of folks in Trump world with Russia, whereas the president had said no one in his campaign had any, that there are these gaps. And I know that you got stuck in a crucible to try and explain these gaps and fell into legal jeopardy. So I read very carefully that you've made a distinction between violations of law and perhaps violations of posture. And I'd love to know how you rationalize what you heard and saw and some of the gestures, because you were held and made accountable for a lot of this.
Sure. And look, there's a multitude of components that kind of fit into this. For example, Paul was already being targeted as a Republican operative that had close ties to the region even before he went to work for Donald Trump. Because as we now are learning, and I think this is an important point, we know a lot more today than we did 3 years ago when this investigation, was first initiated. And I think it's very important to make sure, we get all the facts. Abraham Lincoln had a great quote, let the people have the facts and the country will be safe. We're still getting there. There's, I think, a lot more information to come out. But in the context of the campaign and specifically with Russia, one of the earliest reactions I saw with the president is he was watching the very idea the media was covering, kind of Trump's overtures to Russia. And he just looked perplexed. He goes, I don't understand why this is such a big deal, because in his mind it wasn't. But the light bulb also went off, and he understood the value of something like this with media. And he constantly was baiting them on this issue. And the best example is the one I raised in the book, where he is doing an impromptu press conference in Miami after he has spent an evening with Gold Star families talking about military veterans, et cetera. And the one thing the media picks up on that day is his little statement about, Vladimir Putin, if you have the emails, let's see them. And he knew it was going to drive the media nuts, and it absolutely did. And of course, it called into question, his interest in association with Russia. But Steve, from my experience, my time with him, I can tell you he knew it baited the media, and that's why he did it. It had nothing to do with any historical relationship, to the point that I even went back and tried to do as much research as I could to understand if there was ever any relationship between him and Vladimir Putin or any other major, Russian government official, and there was absolutely none. And it was
You very clearly articulate your knowledge and awareness that Russia was trying to meddle in the U.S. election, and you make it clear that it had meddled in previous elections. But you're very, very overt about that. What do you think keeps the American president from being as overt as his deputy campaign manager?
Well, sure. I mean, remember, at the time, today we knew a lot more. So that was one of the most disturbing things about, the Russia investigation in 2016 is not just Russia, but we've had plenty of adversaries that have been interfering in our elections for decades. And no government has decided to, make this pronouncement that we've got to now look into this. Why was it that 2016 was the only year that we really started focusing on it seriously? And again, there's additional information that's coming out that we may now see that there's more to the story about Wyatt, and it was done as a political diversion tactic. We'll see if it turns out to be true as more of the truth comes out. But I think from that standpoint, again, the president's not a politician. He doesn't understand all this nuanced behavior with Russia in politics and foreign policy before he's campaigning. So that was a big part of it, is he didn't anticipate how big of a story this, would be. I think we'd have to ask him if he ever regrets any of his statements about Russia. I personally don't think he does, but I would be curious too, why let the media control this part of the narrative? Because it was absolutely not accurate in the way that they portrayed it.
Another jaw dropper for me in your book, honestly, was what they found, the perjury charge that they found you guilty of. As I understand it, you were not in a meeting with Paul Manafort and former Congressman Vin Weber, who was a consultant that had to do with Ukraine, and you corrected a statement where you said one of them had said, that the meeting had gone well, and then you thought, well, maybe both of them said that, and you said, no, one had. That triggered a perjury charge against you. I never saw that. I had, when I first read about this, I said, they caught Rick Gates in a serious lie. Is how it is. But I just want to understand the pressure you were under. I think it's important for our viewers to understand, to be fair in this story. Am I recounting this correctly? Because it's fascinating if true.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a very hard part of the process for me, because this was kind of a deal breaker in terms of agreeing to any cooperation. And it honestly took me the better part of almost 2 years to unpack what had happened, particularly since we went to the special counsel's office and volunteered, the information. This isn't something where they caught me, in an overt lie. And that's what made it even harder. And the fact that my lawyer was there as well was very, very disconcerting. And it goes to show you.
But I mean, sorry to interrupt you, Rick. This was about whether or not you recounted whether one of two men had said whether a meeting had gone well. That's all it was about. And then you said, no, one of them, Paul Manafort, said the meeting had gone well, not Vin Weber. I just find it remarkable that your life was put in such jeopardy over that statement.
Yeah, but again, if you understand the rationale for it, and at the moment I didn't, but if you look at what, and again, this is a brilliant, unethical, in my opinion, tactic used by the special counsel. And when they have absolute authority to determine who lies and who doesn't, you're really put in a very, very difficult, position. And in this case, it was, quite disturbing that they were able to do this. And if you look, and I did this after, Steve, look at every single person involved was charged with perjury.
Right.
Why is that? If you step back, it's because we get to this point where now I can go out and talk. They wanted to make sure that I was as discredible as possible so that they could use that and make it sound like when all this information came out, that it wasn't necessarily believable. And again, I think it was a tactical move, a diabolical tactical move, but every single person involved had a perjury charge leveled against them.
Rick, just quickly, you're very close to power in the Trump team, or were, and you make a call for a kind of politics that returns to compromise, that returns to listening to one another, that returns to kind of healthy Democrats and healthy Republicans. I'd like to just give our viewers a snapshot, since you are caught in this trap, of what you'd like to see for the future of American politics.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's anybody that should be angry over what happened, I could say, it would be me. But anger is destructive. If you let it consume you, it'll destroy your life. So I really wanted to step back, and at the end is really hope that the American people can read this story and understand that we can learn from it, and we can learn from each other. And I think that's kind of an art that we've all lost. I think politics obviously has become very divisive, and we have a difficult time even talking amongst our own families about it. And I think we need to get past that. We need to figure out how we can once again learn from each other, learn tolerance, political tolerance, from each other, and really, kind of embrace this idea that our country will be better for it. Because I think the most disturbing thing out of all this in both the political system and the brokenness of the justice system is, as I said, watching our adversaries kind of allow us to tear ourselves from within.
Right. Well, Rick Gates, former Trump campaign official, author, and a star witness for the Mueller investigation, thank you so much for being with us today.
Steve, I enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your time.
So what's the bottom line? In the last election, more than 60 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, who never held a public office, for being raw, direct, impulsive, and not constrained by accuracy and truth. In other words, he's the opposite of most politicians, saying and tweeting whatever he feels like whenever he feels like it. And a lot of people will continue to celebrate this kind of intentional, pugnacious Trumpism, even if he isn't reelected. This is not just an American thing. Love him or hate him, a lot of folks prefer a strong man who does it his way over politicians who promise a lot but rarely deliver. And that's the bottom line.